start. So before we do the talk this evening, I don't know if you've noticed, this was announced at the start of this term. This is now the Linton Kwesi Johnson Lecture Theatre. Most of you know who Linton Kwesi Johnson is, and others of you don't, so I'll do a quick introduction. He's an incredibly important person for race politics in this country. So Linton Kwesi Johnson is a dog poet. He came to this country in the first generation of Windrush workers. If you don't know Windrush, it was one of the boats that was used to bring people from the Caribbean to Britain to compensate for the diminished workforce. So lots of people who were white British especially got killed in this country in the Second World War. There wasn't a worker force to have a successful economy, so people were forced over as migrants from the Caribbean and other parts of the colonies. Linton Kwesi Johnson came over, I think, in the early 60s with his parents. He was a graduate from Goldsmiths, in sociology in the early 70s. And then from that went into various kinds of work and also established a career as a poet. And at that time, if you don't know, there was of course a lot of racism in this country from people objecting to migrant workers, but also a lot of anti-racism and anti-racist activism. And Linton Kwesi Johnson was a key figure in that anti-racist activism, especially in this area. So if you've seen the mural by the library, which is a mural about the anti-Nazi protest, which happened just there, and you've seen the commemoration plaque to the New Cross fire in the early 80s, which is, if you go a little bit towards Deptford from New Cross Station, these were key moments in the history of anti-racism in Britain, and they're located exactly in this area. Right? So Goldsmiths has been integrally tied into that history. At this point in time, given all the shit about anti-racism, because it's obviously under duress from right-wing fascist forces. Linton Kwesi Johnson's come back as, again, an important figure to think about how art, culture, music, and so popular culture can be used for anti-racism. I'm going to play you a little bit, just so if you don't know it, you get a sense of what he did.
Brixton Prison, Gem Avenue, London Southwest 2, England. Dear Mama, good day. I hope that when these few lines reach you, they may find you in the best of them. Mama, I really don't know how to tell you this, cause I didn't make a solemn promise to take care of little Jim and try my best to look out for him. Mama, I really did try my best, but nonetheless, I'm sorry to tell you, sir, poor little Jim get a rest. It was the middle of the rush hour, when everybody just a hustle and a bustle to go home to the evening shower. Me and Jim stand up, waiting for the bus, not causing no fuss, when all of a sudden, a police van pull up. Out from 3 policemen, the whole of them carrying baton. They walk straight up to me and Jim. One of them hold on to Jim, so them taking him in. Jim tell them to let go of him, for him not do nothing, and him not teeth, not even a button. When Jim start to wriggle, the police start to giggle. Mama, make I tell you what them do to Jim. Mama, make I tell you what them do to him. Them thump him in the belly and him turn to jelly. Them lick him on him back and him rip get up. Them lick him on him head but him tough like lead. Them kick him in him seed and him start to bleed. Mama, I just couldn't stand up there and I do nothing. So me took one in him eye and him started to cry. Me took one in him mouth and him started to shout. Me keep one on him chin and him started to spin. Me thump him on him chin and him dropped on a pin. Cry, and dead. Mama, more policemen come down and beat me to the ground. Them charge Jim Kissos. Them charge me for murder. Mama, don't fret. Don't get depressed and down on me. Be of good courage till I hear from you. I remain your son, Sonny.
This is also guitar solos. So basically, if you didn't understand what he was saying, this is a song about anti-black police brutality. So what we see in ICE at the moment, what we saw with that Black Lives Matter protest a few years ago. This is a British version of articulating the making anti-black police brutality obvious and visible in a media system which wasn't like today because it was controlled by 3 channels. This kind of cultural production, this kind of popular music was very important at that point, and it was done here essentially. So I think Goldsmith doesn't get a lot of things right at the moment. I think one of the things that has got right is naming this group after the basic things. So we're going to thank you. So we're going to now. What's happening? Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Al to introduce the talks.
Okay, let's start. So we have the second in the series of the labour of intergenerational transmission of necromancy and future imaginaries. This is our programme so far. We've got on the 2nd of March, Lucia Petrosity, talking really around leaning into examples from a decade of curating and art practice, particularly in relation to art and ecology, material practices, with the title All That Remains of the Changing Seasons, which seems quite apt at the moment. And then on the 16th of March, we've got Lola Olufemi, our last speaker in the series, looking at temporal landscape and aesthetics of practice and material social movements. So again, all in this ongoing series, but tonight, really want to welcome Dr. Becca Voelcker. The title of this evening's talk is the same title as the book, which is behind me, Land Cinema in an Age of Extractivism. Dr. Becca Voelcker is a writer and a historian of art, film and visual culture. Much of her work considers senses of place. Raised in rural Wales and living in central Tokyo as a young adult, she later moved to the USA to complete a PhD at Harvard University. Becca is currently a lecturer at Goldsmiths, University of London, working across a range of programs, but particularly BA. Okay. In 2024, Becca was named a BBC New Generation Thinker. Her first book, Land of Cinema in an Age of Extractivism or Extraction, is a cross-cultural history of eco-political cinema. I've had a chance to skip through it very, very quickly. It looks amazing. The book launched alongside a BBC radio programme and a curated film season at the Barbican. You can see further details of this on Becca's website. We've got the book here, and Suhail is going to do the Q&A towards the end, so I really hope you enjoy this presentation from Becca.
Just to say, sorry, before you get the book's going to be for sale outside after the talk, correct? And there's going to be a bar as well, which is a student fundraising bar at the same time, so we'll hang around afterwards. The book's on sale at discount price as well, just for this evening. That's all. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.
you so much, Al. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Edgar, for having me. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight. I know so many of you, and that's a really nice thing to say. It's a really nice feeling. Thanks for being here. So tonight's talk introduces my book, Land Cinema in an Age of Abstraction. And I want to tell you about everything in the book, but we don't have that much time. And in respect to your evening and your social lives, I'm just going to offer a deep dive, a kind of focus into one aspect of the book, and hope you find that interesting. Both to give you a taste of some of the extraordinary filmmakers and artists that I'm writing about, the sort of characters that populate my book, and to offer a glimpse of how I approach history, how I approach archival research, and how I think about writing as an end-placed practice. And what I mean there will become quite clear. And I'm going to end tonight with a short reading from the book so you can hear what that writing sounds like. So, Land Cinema, this book explores the lives and the works of 10 non-fiction filmmakers and collectives from the 1970s and 80s. And then in the final chapter of the book, I talk about 3 contemporary examples. So this is a map in which you can see them. And it's a map, and we could say it's a book of perspectives. Each perspective tells us something about whose points of view are shown and whose points of view are erased from the land. And indeed, all of my writing about lens-based media looks at images as perspectives. Photographs and films labelled as documentary are often treated as evidence because of their mechanical and therefore apparently objective production. This happened, here is photographic evidence of it. But as many theorists of documentary pointed out, from Trinity Min Ha to Pooja Rangan, documentary's claims to authenticity asserts authority over places and stories. So the task at hand is to ask whose perspective are we seeing and whose is being overlooked. To ask why was this image made? Every image proposes a narrative, a politics, a demand. Asking how an image, and therefore an idea of a land or a people, was made, and for what political purpose, is central to this book. So another way of seeing this map is as a cartography of powers and purposes, a shifting terrain of activities, some activities measured as contributing to GDP growth, others apparently worthless. Such a map begs questions. Well, who gets to measure growth and value and progress, and by what metric? So what I mean here, what I'm getting at, put very simply, is activities like wars or oil spills are measured as growth for a nation because of the military spending and the cleanup operations that they entail. Growing your own food or caring for others is invisible to GDP growth. And Land Cinema, this book, chronicles countless activities such as this. Activities like documenting the establishment of a cooperative farm or a community garden, making a film club, having literacy drives, all these networks of local and international solidarity. All of these are apparently worthless on GDP terms, so the book is inviting us to shift our metrics of measurement. Land Cinema films, then, are focused on perspectives, on inviting us to think about whose perspective are we seeing. And they're critical and creative at the same time. What I mean by this is they are oppositional and propositional. They expose structures of oppression at the same time as constructing alternative social architectures. These are spaces of learning and spaces of living in what Max Liboiron calls land relation. So although this book is, on one hand, about film, on another level it reads as a history of experiments in living in the cracks and the fissures of extractive capitalism. And I'm borrowing from Anna Singh here, who many of you will know, to consider the potential of working from the so-called marginal spaces in the edgelands of the mainstream. Land cinema constructs an economic argument against those financialized measures of value, of growth, of progress that I mentioned, against this extractive logic, this approach to land and to livelihoods. And land cinema argues for ethical and ecological metrics, shifting what matters, what gains visibility, what holds value. Put differently, this book shows that alternatives can exist and have existed. Whereas emergency images, the kind of image that T.J. DeMoss calls burning aesthetics, so think forest fires, floods, famines, whereas those kinds of images often lack critical context regarding causality, they often present misery as if there was no alternative, and they often leave audiences in paralysed alarm. Land cinema advances land and lens-based approaches to climate justice as possible blueprints for the future. If, as Amitav Ghosh has written, climate crisis is a crisis of imagination, then land cinema's intervention is in imagining and then enacting, filming and screening perspectives that value this non-extractive mode of being and that look beyond the dominant and deadly present. So I've written this book, I've written Land Cinema for my peers and my students, so that is basically you. And especially for a generation born after 1980, now wondering what happened in the decades immediately preceding our births to so widen a rift between humans and nature and between dominant actors and their objects of exploitation, but wondering also who resisted this. Here are 10 filmmakers and collectives who resisted. And perhaps we can return to this in the discussion afterwards, but I'll note here a methodological concern I have in writing from my own situated, embodied and historical perspective. So, for example, I bring up the idea of a generation, that I'm curious at what happened before my birth. Drawing on Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's idea of reparative reading, I approached the archive with my own rural Welsh background in mind, as well as a very pressing foreground, the contemporary crisis that we have in the climate breakdown. So I write with historical images and films in a way that Sedgwick describes as being open to resonances and emotional connection. So rather than drawing conclusions as a stable and a knowing subject, Sedgwick writes, the reparative reader engages with material to enrich understandings of where we are now and how we got here, but also how we might envision futures differently. Let's stay with this map for a minute longer. It's important also, this map, because it's a diagram of connections. Many land cinema filmmakers and collectives knew of each other. I'm wondering if yeah, I did, good. I thought I did that slide. I had fun thinking about all the connections that these groups and individuals had. They were committed to a really internationalist form of solidarity, sharing films, literature, letters and ideas across geopolitical borders. And simultaneously, they worked from highly localized, specific places. And in this, they understood what Elizabeth Povinelli calls a differential but globally shared relation to extractive capitalism. And this book tells their story, proposing land cinema as a genre, as a rubric, and I hope as a framework that will go on to help others analyse film or visual culture in other regions. So I'd like to take you back now, back in time, to Japan. In chapters 2 and 3 of the book, I focus on two remarkable and remarkably contrasting approaches to land that occurred at the same time in Japan around 1970. One of them in rural Yamagata in the north, and the other in downtown Tokyo. So here we have the country and the city, and two very different understandings of how these places relate. This is an image of Ogawa Productions, Ogawa Pro for short, a filmmaking collective founded by the documentarian Ogawa Shinsuke in 1968. And at that time, amidst rapid economic growth and American influence, remember the USA occupied Japan in the post-war period, Japan was fast changing, it was urbanizing. Wheat imports were outpacing domestic rice production, and farmers who were growing food felt really forgotten. Emerging from a heady atmosphere of political unrest in the late 1960s, 1968, as you'll know, was this huge moment of politics across the world, including in Japan, in Tokyo. Ogawa Shinsuke, this is the guy we see in the middle here, he gathered a collective of young activists and filmmakers, and he wanted to start representing farmers' plight. And in their early work as a collective, they went to farmland that is now Narita International Airport. So for anybody who's been to Japan, you may have flown into Tokyo, and if you didn't land in Haneda, you would have come to Narita. Narita used to be farmland, centered around some villages, including Sanrizuka. And there was massive opposition when the building of this airport, Narita Airport, was announced. There was huge opposition amongst farmers, but also amongst many activists, green environmentalists, who were opposing the construction of an international airport. And another reason for that was this was the time of the Vietnam War, and there were big fears that US planes would use Narita to refuel on the way to Vietnam. So for over 6 years, activists and farmers on this farmland struggled in very violent combat, trying to resist police who were militarized and incredibly violent. And Ogawa Productions were there throughout it all with their cameras, and they made films to document this struggle. And they screened these films, protest films, black and white, very urgent, rough and ready. They screened them for audiences around Japan, self-distributing them, driving them around in a van, like this, and screening them in, basically, we can think of them as pop-up theatres, in village halls, in farmers' associations. And in 1975, when they went and screened one of their films in rural Yamagata, in the north of Japan, after the screening, this local villager came up to the collective and said, hey, if you really want to make films about farmers, hadn't you better get your hands dirty, get in the field yourself, actually learn how to farm? And Ogawa Shinsuke loved this kind of provocation and its anecdotal power, and he said, from then on, from that moment onwards, I knew we had to go back to the land, and the collective packed up their bags, drove to rural Yamagata, and settled there. And they stayed there for 18 years, living together communally in a shared farmhouse where they cooked together, where they edited films, discussed their work, and learned how to grow rice. And they harvested several tons of rice over the years, and they made several unwieldy films. So these films, they merge science documentary, historical reenactment, poetic sequences, and long-form interviews. They were much too rambling for most cinemas, so Ogawa Pro toured them themselves, even one time building their own theatre from mud and thatch. This mode of filmmaking and screening involved the entire community. And there's a strong connection here and elsewhere in the book when I discuss collectives in Colombia, for example, in Wales, in Mali. There's a strong connection here with the third cinema movement. This was a cinema of imperfection, of urgency, of grassroots and leftist solidarity. Now, audiences who knew of Ogawa Pro's protest films, the black and white films they were making at the airport, were really confused at first because the newsletters, this is an example of a newsletter that the collective would make. The newsletters used to be about the political struggle at the airport. And slowly the newsletters began filling with reports on rice saplings and the weather. And people thought, where had the politics gone? The politics has totally disappeared. These people have moved back to the land and they've sort of escaped or something. But herein lies Ogawa Pro's importance and its contribution also to third cinema, I think. The collective injected a distinctly eco-political politics into activism, recognising land and the human, animal and atmospheric conditions in land as fundamental for survival. So remember, amidst this economic boom in Japan, the Japanese economy is like ballooning from this post-war growth into a real bubble economy. Japan's the second richest nation in the world at one point. Amidst that, Ogawa Pro is showing that growth can mean something completely different to GDP. Growth could mean a blossoming of cultural engagement. It could mean an expansion of communal green space, a resurgence in wildlife and biodiversity, and increased ecological and political literacy. This was growth for them. And in our contemporary context of climate breakdown, and amidst debates about degrowth strategies to curb carbon emissions, seen in the work of people like Kohei Saito, Ogawa Pro offer clues for how ideas of growth and progress might be re-evaluated. Now I'll show you a really short trailer from my favourite Ogawa Pro film. You'll probably be pleased to hear I'm not going to show you like a 3.5-hour one, because some of them are that long. This is actually a really short one, and I have a clip of it. I screened this film at the Barbican when I did a season of land cinema at Barbican in London in November, and it's called Red Persimmons, or Manzan Benigaki, and it was shot in the 1970s. Let's see if the tech will work for me. Yes. It's like a minute long.
そしてある日ね、なんかこうろうそくの寿命が消えるようにですね、おそらくね、ポッとこう、僕は具体的に言っていくつあげられるから、この周りでも、ポッとこう消えてきて、それは小川さんたちがこっちに来て、その8年間の間にも随分な発想をやもう消えました。かなり消えてます。それが自然に消えてるんですね。自然、いや、不自然なんですが、自然の形で消えるんです。そのことを僕はやっぱり記録者としてはですね、やはりこういう時代にこういう消え方をしていくということもあるわけですね。それは今なお思いますね。
The date on this, by the way, is because it was shot in the 70s and then it was edited and completed and released in 2001 by a younger filmmaker after this collective had disbanded. So I want to add a few kind of complicating factors when we talk about Ogawa Pro, because it wasn't without its issues. And this is where, for me, it gets interesting. I love writing about this kind of complication. So, for example, I've talked a lot about going back to the land, that phrase, back to the land. The collector's idea of what a rural community life was like was really infused with idealism, quite a romanticized idea. And there's even a word for this in Japanese, which is furusato. And furusato literally means like old place. It's your old village. The idea is it's like your roots, back where you're from. But there's a whole industry of furusato in, thought I had a slide for this, no, sorry. There's a whole industry of furusato or rural nostalgia tourism in Japan. Like now you can pay money to go out from Tokyo on the train and plant rice saplings or pick persimmon fruits, which is what the farmer is doing in the film. So Ogawa was selected in which parts of history he wanted to celebrate, drawing extensively from the work of the folklorist Yanagita Kunio, and from one particular era in Japan's history, the Edo period, which is the sort of isolationist, most Japanese era, we could say. So they were forging this sometimes quite essentialist form of ethnic environmentalism. One example of this was their fixation on rice. Rice as being this quintessentially Japanese crop, even though actually if we look at other indigenous peoples in Japan, they were not necessarily growing rice, and rice comes actually from the Korean peninsula, but from China originally. But in these films, they're thinking rice is Japanese. It's like almost a synonym for Japanese identity. Another issue that I found interesting was labour. So I mentioned it's a collective. They all live together in a big farmhouse. Unfortunately, this being the 70s, they're radical in some ways and they're completely short-sighted in others, which is the idea of gender. So women, the wives of the collective, were largely confined to housework, raising the children, cooking for the collective. And then another issue, some of you might find this interesting if you're working in quite material ways, if you're a studio practitioner, is this idea of shooting on film. So if you might have heard analog film, sometimes being called celluloid film. That's because celluloid film contains cellulose, which is from pulverized plant material, often cotton plants actually. And in this book, I'm generally talking about filmmakers who were working on film, who were using celluloid, and several of them really love this idea of celluloid because they feel like they're working with something that's a bit botanic itself. It's a bit like plant-like material. Now, they're not wrong, but again, it's a selective idea because celluloid film also contains a bunch of animal and bovine gelatin material and lots of much more highly toxic and extractive materials. It's a very industrialized process to make film. So it's hardly natural. It's a very, very processed composite. But as Raymond Williams writes, ideas of nature often reveal a lot about the ideas and ideals of the societies from which they come. So Ogawa goes back to the land project is fascinating, I think, in both what its images show, but also what they leave out. And throughout the book, I refer to many land cinema films as landscape portraits, to gesture at this infusion of space and society, or places and the people who inhabit them. Let's look at another reaction to space and society, another mode in which people have been shaped by place and in turn have represented it. So here's another perspective from Japan, same era, same Tokyo, but is it? So the body of film, photography and writing I discuss in chapter 3 also emerges from eco-political activism, but its aesthetic, as you can probably see from this slide, could not be more different to Ogawa Pro's back to the land pastoralism. And the loose body of work that came to be known as Fukeidon is what I'm talking about here. So Fukeidon literally means landscape theory. Fukeidon films and photographs can only be described as anti-pastoral. Fukeidon argued that by 1970, Japan had been paved and developed all over into a series of Tokyo copies. There was no countryside left, they said. And Fukeidon's task was to turn the camera's lens on this landscape of concrete uniformity, to view it as a diagram of alienation. And they wrote, landscape Fuke equals power. They documented how this post-war capitalist expansion was desecrating nature, suffocating the landscape with what Yuriko Furuhata describes as an infrastructure of efficiency and control. In 1969, the filmmaker Adachi Masao travelled across Japan, filming nondescript road intersections and office blocks. Now the word for landscape in Japanese, fukei, contains the word for scenery. That's K, scenery. But the scenery that we find in Fukeidon is less scenic than dreary. The scenes are really an affront to landscape tradition. We have concrete curbs, there are billboards, smog obscures the shots, reducing the depth of the field. So it's not very scenic. In Japanese landscape gardening, there is an aesthetic technique known as shake, and shake literally means borrowed scenery. It's got the same K as the scenery in Fukeidon. Shake is a way of designing gardens so that you're borrowing the scenery from beyond the garden. So in this example, you're borrowing the scenery of the mountainscape beyond the walls of the moss garden and the engawa, which is the veranda. So distant mountains, for example, lend this feeling of expansiveness. We're borrowing a feeling of expansive space, borrowing it into the garden. Now, Adachi Masao, his frustration of space suggests a critical adaptation of shake, borrowing now a socio-political scenery of alienation. The film connects foreground and background, everyday life, and its political context. While the pictorial space is no longer deep because it's blocked by buildings and barriers, the affective space of political malaise is profound. Seen today, Fukeidon presents an important contribution, I think, to discourse about the Anthropocene, that is our age of human-made changes to the environment. Fukeidon diagrams a specifically capitalist set of causes for climate breakdown and social alienation that pervade the atmosphere of everyday life. And again, let's think about that word fukei. The word itself anticipates this emphasis on atmosphere, containing the character for wind, fu, that affects the scene, the K. The character for wind also appears in the word for climate, by the way, fudo. And I find it really helpful to think about words in this way, what do words actually contain. This word fukei helps us understand a set of resonances and implications. Fukei suggests that climate, that the landscape, is conditioned by atmosphere. In Japanese, a common phrase for somebody who can't, what would we say in English, you can't read the room in English. In Japanese you say kuki ga yomenai, the person can't read the air. Fukeidon reads the air, attuning to the affective conditions of everyday life, its alienation, its anger, its anxiety. As an audience, we're invited to view these anxious landscapes as crime scenes, and extractive capitalism is the perpetrator here. Intuiting the atmosphere, pointing the finger or turning the lens on capitalism and ecological damage, this anticipates the recent work of Kohei Saito, who I mentioned earlier in connection with his work on degrowth. So one of Kohei Saito's central ideas he takes from Karl Marx, and it's known as metabolic rift. And in really basic terms, metabolic rift is this idea that if we think of nature as a metabolism, then overly intensive practices of extraction, industry, chemical agribusiness, for example, exhaust that natural cycle, exhausts the soil and also exhausts the workers, the human and animal labour power. Fukeidon cinematically illustrates the metabolic rift that Marx identified in industrialized societies, where nature's resources and labour power are exploited in too rapid and intensive a way. Landscapes like this one in this photograph by Takuma Nakahira, landscapes look exhausted, they're drained of colour and energy. And people, if we see them at all in the films or the photographs, they're rushing by, they're perhaps on their way to work or home after long shifts in the factory or the office. And In the chapter, I talk more about Takuma Nakahira and the photography group with which he was involved, which is known as Provoke, connected to a photography journal. The filmmaker I mentioned, Adachi Masao, who'd driven through Japan filming really banal scenes of everyday life as if they're crime scenes. The protagonist of his film is called AKA Serial Killer. The protagonist of Adachi Masao's film is never seen in the whole film. We never see the serial killer about which this film is made. The protagonist seems to have been so exhausted, so alienated, so angered by Japanese life in this era that he has turned to violence. And I discuss his predicament and the polluted urbanized landscapes that he inhabited in this chapter to make a contrast, to establish a contrast between the backs of the land pastoralism of Ogawa Pro in Yamagata and this very, very polluted, dangerous scene that we find in Fukeidon. Two responses to the same changing context. Polluted landscapes must feature in conversations about land if we're to address climate justice adequately. Fukeidon presents us with images of malaise, of a metabolism that's been completely disrupted, of wounded land, to borrow a phrase from Leanne Simpson that I use throughout this book. I'm going to show you, I'm going to play a short excerpt from the film. The sound in this is quite interesting. It's low in this section of the film, but sometimes it's really loud. There's like free jazz that is interrupting and sort of jars with the images sometimes and sets the landscape on edge. And occasionally we get voiceover of like a news report telling us about this serial killer who's shot 4 people and is escaped and is on the run through Japan. But as I say, we never ever see the serial killer. We never see anyone in the film. There aren't people. If we see people, they're a truck driver in front of us or there's somebody rushing by. All we get is reports of this person who is on the run. This footage that I'm showing here, shot from inside a taxi, is sped up so fast that the sequence, extended over 3 minutes, becomes really nightmarish. Cutting the standard frame rates with which we're accustomed to seeing motion, Adachi conjures a world of headlong panic. Without an over-the-shoulder perspective as a buffer, we occupy the passenger seat as a hostage, with no indication of where or how our journey will end. Resembling a phantom ride genre popular in early cinema, where footage was shot from a moving vehicle travelling through a city or a landscape at speed, the sequence nods at film's own modern and urban-centric historical development. But in Fukeidon's lens, a political critique of urban modernity drives this sequence, an eco-political critique, we could say. This is no celebration of cinema. Anticipating a crash, the audience is held in suspense, with the film suggesting that the capitalist metropolis will speed on further and faster towards its own destruction, spreading its tentacles into the countryside. And you can see by now it's got more green. It's like the city is reaching out ever further into the countryside. The ideas I've outlined here didn't stay confined to Japan in the 1970s, and today many filmmakers and artists see Ogawa Pro and Fukeidon as points of reference. So the Chinese filmmaker Zhang Mengqi, for example, who I discuss in the final chapter of the book, came to know of Ogawa Pro through a film festival which Ogawa Shinsuke established just before he died. Film festival, Yamagata International Documentary Film Festival, amazing festival and community, established in 1992. And this is where I actually first met Zhang Mengqi herself. So Zhang, this filmmaker, Chinese filmmaker, makes films in the village of her grandparents in rural Hubei province. She's made over 15 documentaries in the village since 2010, contributing hundreds of hours of film to an initiative called the Folk Memory Project, which is an online archive of oral history, presenting rural perspectives otherwise censored or forgotten. Zhang's village is now home to mainly old people and their grandchildren, while parents have migrated to the city for work. Zhang has made the opposite move, returning from Beijing to live in the village. So Zhang Longqi trained actually as a dancer and an artist in Beijing, but she's come back to this family village. And she says, I'm an unusual kind of auntie here, carrying my camera with her everywhere. She films, by the way, on a small digital camera. She says, I call the village 47 kilometres because this is the instruction given to bus drivers. Stop 47 kilometres from the city. Each of Zhang's films, which she calls self-portraits, has 47 kilometres in its title. And this naming is very interesting because it indicates a distance from rural life. She's saying, this is happening 47 km from the city. So you might think then that the village is a peripheral backwater out in the sticks, a margin to the centre. But Zhang's attentive, patient documentaries portray the village as a centre unto itself. Time is slower here. Memories run deeper. I ate tree bark and soil to survive, an old villager tells Zhang, remembering the Great Famine which saw tens of millions of people starve to death between 1959 and 1961. China's Great Famine is absent from school history textbooks and it's censored in the media, but here its shadows linger. And as the nation races on, pronouncing economic and technological advancements, Zhang films days, seasons, and farmers in their own rhythms, and she actually cites Ogawa Shinsuke, who called this village time. Due to censorship in China, Zhang's films can't be shown in public cinemas, so instead she screens them abroad in film festivals and via online streaming. And she also shares the films in the village as live events for the community, accompanied by food and dancing. And recognising themselves on screen, villagers feel seen and heard. They come over, Zhang says, and they tell me what I should film next. And recently she's been teaching children how to use cameras and interview the grandparents themselves. So this girl, who she's been filming for a long time, she's now taught how to make film, and she gave a camera to this girl, so that this girl, who's now a young adult, is making film. So I think you can probably see how much Zhang Longqi's work resonates with Ogawa Pro in 1970s Japan. We've got the celebration of rural life, the emphasis on oral history, folk culture, memories, the community engagement of showing and sharing film in these screenings that become these sort of village parties. Meanwhile, Fukeidong, from the late 1960s and early 1970s, has influenced the Filipinx and Taiwanese American artist filmmakers Enzo Camacho and Amy Lien, who I also discuss in the final chapter of this book. So this couple makes films and community art and agriculture and activist projects on the sugarcane plantation island of Negros in the Philippines. And they cite Fukeidong, the Japanese landscape theory, as an influence for how they film seemingly banal landscapes as diagrams of alienation, where political power hides in plain sight. On Negros, there are two words for hunger. One describes regular hunger, and the other a hunger that deadens the body and mind when a person hasn't eaten for days. In a film that Camacho and Lien made in 2023 called Heaven and Earth, an islander describes how that deadly kind of hunger gnaws at his stomach. This is what sugar farmers endure, he says, for 3 to 4 months each year. So on this island, in the plantations, like the one you're seeing here, this is a still from the film, sugarcane is the only crop. The land is owned by businesses exporting this sugarcane abroad. And farmers go without income after the harvest when the land lies fallow. And they call these grueling months tiempo muerto, or dead season. But Camacho and Lien's film is not only about hunger. Beside the plantations, islanders cultivate communal plots, vegetable plots. They're growing their own aubergine, their own peas, sweet potatoes, okra, spinach. The Philippines is one of the deadliest countries in the world for environmental and land activists. But despite this constant intimidation and threats of death, farmers cultivate these small plots to sustain themselves and to resist the landowner's monopoly. And they call this agrarian activism bungkalan, which is a Tagalog word, and it comes from the word bungkal, which means to till soil. So you have this this idea of cultivating the soil as also immediately being a political act of resistance. Camacho and Lien, the artist filmmakers, continue bungkalan by bringing the culture of making images to the agriculture of cultivating land. Self-sufficiency in food production meets self-representation on screen. Farmers sustain themselves and tell their own stories. The film combines scenes recorded on a digital camera with footage shot on analog celluloid film. And as I mentioned in the discussion of Ogawa Pro earlier, amongst other more industrial ingredients, celluloid film does contain cellulose plant fiber. And Camacho and Lien take this botanical idea and they extend it, they do something really interesting. So, using a little known technique called phytography, the artists develop the film stock with natural chemicals found within plants that are growing in the plots beside the plantation. So we're looking here at shapes of plants grown outside and in resistance to the plantation, imprinted and developed on film that is made with those same botanical ingredients. So the film's material basis becomes a form of bungkalan, of agrarian activism. These phytograms also make an eco-critical intervention into the very urban-centric history of photography and of cinema by inviting us to consider the filmic material as an index for histories of labour and land use. Extending filmmakers' materialist interest in celluloid film since the 1970s and resonating with a more recent materialist turn in film studies that analyse the chemical composition of film stock, phytography addresses cinema's extractivist material legacy by experimenting with sustainable alternatives. Working from a crisis point on Negros Island, from that tiempo muerto, from that dead season of extractive plunder, the filmmakers and the community turn their attention, their labour, their lands and their lenses towards an alternative. And I use the word crisis here quite carefully. So, crisis, I use in this book, towards the end of the book, as I turn to our present, to think about our present planetary predicament. But I don't use crisis as a way to evoke a state of paralysis or alarm or deadlock. Instead, I'm really interested in, again, the etymology of this word. If you look up the word crisis, you'll see it actually comes from a medical definition of a turning point in an illness. So a crisis was a turning point, a point of change, after which, hopefully, the patient would start recovering and that your body begins to fight the germs, whatever is going on. So crisis is about a change of course. What if climate crisis is also a potential turning point? And images can move people affectively and politically to change individual, collective and systemic behaviours. think about with crisis is a question of time, of history. So as many climate justice scholars, including Kyle White, have pointed out, crisis is too often presented as something that is suddenly befallen us, rather than the condition of life for many of the world's poorest peoples for 5 centuries of colonial and extractive predation. Land cinema's eco-political agency lies in this reparative capacity that it has. It lies in land cinema's kind of deep memory. Many filmmakers attend to the generational legacy of land dispossession and land despoliation that is sedimented in the ground in layers and that is imprinted on people's lives. Land cinema's longer view across history also opens space for acknowledging historical instances of strength and solidarity, not just suffering. Working against an insistence that there is no alternative to capitalism, that highly annoying phrase, land cinema offers grounded evidence that other ways can and have flourished. Employing what Saidiya Hartman calls the subjunctive tense of history, land cinema enables us to ask, what if we were to live differently? What if growth and progress meant multi-species abundance, as they did for this farming collective, this cooperative farm, Somankidikura in Mali? I speak about them in the second chapter of the book. They rejuvenated an exhausted plantation in a former colony. Or what if development signified a social movement toward solidarity? Our current understandings of these terms of growth, of progress, of development is conditioned by extractivism. Other economies would support other expanded definitions. Land cinema offers glimpses of an outside to historical order in this sense, a counter-narrative, another arrangement of the possible, as Saidiya Hartman puts it. But if we consider Somankidikura's farming and filmmaking, or Camacho and Lien's Bunker land in the Philippines, these are hardly projects that culminate in packageable film projects. Instead, these practices demonstrate that land cinema is a social and spatial commitment that encompasses film, filmmaking, film screening, film culture, and then extending off the edge of the screen, out of the projection room, and into the discussions and the barricades and the vegetable plots. And although, and perhaps especially because most of us, all of us, I think, have a screen in our pockets, and we can watch anything at the swipe of a finger, the experience that land cinema offers of gathering as collective makers and audiences, gathering like we are now in this room, achieves heightened significance. So I think precisely because we're living in this algorithmic era when everything is personalized to us and we have headphones and we can watch film all on our own, it becomes even more important and welcome to watch things together. And this is what the people in this book were doing half a century ago. Cinema's promise of a social architecture has never been more important. Watching together, land cinema can carry us out of ourselves to experience other perspectives and other landscapes, at the same time that it situates our own perspective within a bigger picture. And I remember when cinema first did this to me, situating my own perspective within a bigger picture. And just to end tonight, I'm going to read the final page, one page from the book, because I promised that you could hear a bit of the voice. So the final section is titled A Cinema Between the Sea and the Mountain, Wales. I'm back in the landscape with which I opened this book's prologue. Mynydd Graig Goch, Red Rock Mountain, is a black silhouette outside the car window. I'm lying on the back seat, heavy with sleep. Outside, the spring air is cool but already scented, and lambing season has begun. I'm coming home from film club. In those years, once a month, volunteers would present a film in the cinema that nestled against the mountains. Below the cinema lay sand dunes and a silky bay. I would eat a chocolate cornetto as the volunteers read their introduction. Wong Kar-wai, Andrei Tarkovsky, Ozu Yasujiro, the names meant nothing to me then. I had no idea what a director was, let alone where to locate directors' works on a map or a timeline. Above us in the projection booth, the reels would thump and crackle, their opening credits in foreign scripts, racking in and out of focus. And then the first scenes, their sights and sounds, scents and temperatures, paces and moods were intoxicating. They transported me far away from my Welsh mountains, and at the same time made me look at my surroundings differently. Those nights, driving home from film club, around the final bend in the track, with Guy Gorch's broad shoulders filling the window frame, my world, now more dream than clarity, became a moving image over which I played others. I saw steam billowing from a noodle stand and a woman in a high-collared silk dress, impossibly glamorous. I could almost smell her. On other nights, there were dreadful scenes of a leaking city, acrid machine oil fog, stray dogs and men, or sunlight, a kimono hung to dry on bamboo canes, a cheerful train, and a red teapot. Carried in the darkness of the sea and the mountain, I watched my first and most intimately known landscape, overlaid by these others, catching bars of music and the intonation of a language I don't yet understand. Land cinema is about being somewhere, and also about being somewhere else, and seeing how these places are connected. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I forgot to give you, you're supposed to have a visual throughout that. That's amazing.
How are we doing on time? Okay. Well,
Yeah, we're fine. I'll do 10 minutes and then we'll do 15 with Q&A. All right. Let's see. Does this work? It's on mute. All right. Let's do some Q&A. I'm going to ask 2 questions of Becca based on having read a little bit of the book. Well, firstly, thank you. And thank you for the kind of the affective end as well. So my questions are essentially, they're not so much about the details of the filmmakers that you present, but more around the category of land cinema. And the first one is about what the people. So the generation you're looking at are making films in the 70s and 80s in relation to kind of industrial capitalism it's kind of coming up to the end of the Bretton Woods period. It's kind of before globalization, so it's kind of like in-betweeny state, which in the West was certainly a period of the first stage of deindustrialization. Right? But I was wondering about you talked about kind of a counter-growth strategy. So there's like proper economic growth, and you're saying there's other model of growth, development, and so on that you're advocating for. And you're saying the people who are doing land cinema are kind of giving us a sense of what this kind of counter-growth might be. But I in the very early map you showed of how there was a lot of interrelation, communication between these different groups of people making work. So there was a kind of a network. And it seemed to me that there's a kind of risk involved in some of this filmmaking, which it does end up looking or leading towards a kind of organicism or a romantic notion of land. So with the Camacho and Leon piece, when you talk about the agribusiness monoculture of the plantation, and then you have the side plot, there's a very clear dichotomy of like agribusiness is bad, the side plot is good, and then that becomes photography. But reading some of the book, it seemed to me that what's very clear from the way you construct the notion of land cinema, which I'll ask about in a minute, there is an international network. So these people are communicating, they are flying from part A of the world to part B of the world, which is very far away. So there's a kind of early intimation of a kind of globalization, which is not like big economic globalization, but like an activist globalization, which I think we're familiar with now. And also, so there's that part of it, which is actually the material conditions for this network of land cinema, but also, as you mentioned, when you talk about film and the celluloid moment, film is, like, as you said, it's like a deeply extractive material. It's part of the petrochemical space. So you can't have films without factories. Similarly with digital stuff now, so even if you're not doing film for that reason, you're still involved with them. When you showed the image from Ogawa Pro with the film camera in the rice field, I was looking at the film camera because it's like that is an industrial object. It looks quite expensive, very classy. But it's like deeply industrial, right? So there's something in the contrast between the rice field, the rice paddy, and the film camera. And I kind of want to kind of just ask you around that sort of engagement with industrial processes, and engagement with the kind of techno-modernity of the time. So using flights, using kind of communication mechanisms that they had, using film clubs, using the film equipment, using film itself. As a way to think through a complexity of how these filmmakers and the country of land cinema situates itself in relation to, I guess, a naive or sort of a romantic view of land.
Yeah. Is my mic on?
No, I don't think so.
I didn't think so.
Do you want to borrow mine?
Is it on now?
No. Borrow mine.
Can I use the handheld one? If that, and then you can keep yours.
We're going to use it for the.
Oh, you're
Q&A.
going to go round. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
So while we set this up, the can I just borrow that again? just to give you this one's working. Yeah. Just to give you get out of my way. Sorry. Okay. So the plan is that I ask Becca a couple of questions just to give you time to think, and then we'll ask you for Q&A, and Red will come around with the mic so that we can hear you. Just use this for now. And then Red can sort that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think internationalism is an important word for understanding what they were doing. So you use the word globalization, and that is certainly happening at this time. 70s moving into the 80s. But I think internationalism describes what they're doing in this network of correspondence, sometimes attending screenings, but often it's through letter writing or it's through sending film reels across the world to each other. And I mentioned third cinema. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the third cinema movement, but maybe not everybody. Third cinema is often associated with Latin America in the 1960s, but it was happening all over the world. And if we think of first cinema as kind of Hollywood filmmaking for profit, second cinema is a European avant-garde cinema, and then third cinema is coming from workers, farmers, people who are thinking about anti-colonial solidarity movements. It's like a really grassroots oppositional cinema. Land cinema grows up with this. Many of the land cinema filmmakers I write about consider themselves members of this third cinema movement. And third cinema is so much about internationalism, because it's so much about seeing, I mentioned in the talk, Elizabeth Popinelli has this neat articulation of it, the shared but differential relation to extractive capitalism. So understanding that, okay, what you've experienced in Mali with French occupation and the the desertification of this land through the plantation economy is related to what we've experienced here in the Philippines, let's say. And sure, we definitely have differences in our contexts, and they don't shy away from the particularities, the specificities of the in-place, the situated, but they're also seeing this link, the kind of, it's very intersectional, this way of thinking. And it's useful for them. So things like anti-colonial independence struggles in the Lusophone world are happening because people in Mozambique, in Cape Verde, speaking with each other and sharing films. And I have like a whole page in the book when I'm just mapping the different connections, like with my slide when I did it with a dotted line, I'm mapping the connections between these filmmakers. Page 13, yeah. Such a great reader, thanks. I couldn't have told you that. I also find it really, like, of course we're all complicit in somehow, of course we're all involved in, we all have a phone in our pocket, we all fly sometimes, and so did they. They were, I think it's really interesting to write about people who were really people. They weren't somehow these like angels or gods or whatever. They had short-sighted moments, they had to use certain technologies, they were interested in using some of these technologies in a critical way. I think it's really interesting to think about lens-based media, photography and film, as something that we always associate with only with the city, but actually it's always depended on the country for growing these materials, for mining the silver that is in the photochemical material. The gelatin comes from cows. You know, Eastman Kodak. Eastman had a flock of cows. Like it's actually these, what we think of as really urban technologies are really, really connected to the rural.
Okay. Are there any questions already? There's one there and one over here. Was there one over there? Okay, so we'll take these. So this one is here.
Thank you, Becca, for sharing all this. I'm really interested in all the things you're talking about, the words, like you research a lot about like landscape and like wind and everything like that. I'm interested in the word land, which you use in the name of your book, because I was curious, like what's the difference between if I call it like ground cinema, soil cinema, earth cinema, why did you choose the word land instead of all other like choices like environmental cinema? Like why is it land? Because land is such a place that like which human can reach. Say like if it's like completely like underwater, you can't breathe, like it's deep inside the water, it's not like land cinema. If it's a place that no one could ever like put a camera there because it's too low temperature and like the film would never work there, then you wouldn't call it like land cinema when it's not completely belong to where humans should be there to have the power to watch, to film, to document. So I think the land cinema is already like hold a power there already, and also it's not all the land will possibly have a cinema, possibly have a camera, and there are so many lands that lose their cinema because of, for example, war or climate change, or because of their just lack of material of making like a camera or like a filmmaking stuff. Or they used to be able to have, but now they don't. They used to have a land there, but because of the climate change, they don't have that land. Or because of the war, they don't have a land, or because of political reason, they lose their land, or the land has changed. And also you were showing like a map at the very beginning of the slides, and like the map is how we shape the land and how we think about the land. where is the central, where is the east, where is the north, where is the west. And that's how we understand and imagine what land is in the map. So like by choosing the map, we are choosing what era that we are thinking about land. And because if I choose a map from like 100 years ago, the land will mean completely different thing. Or like 1 million years ago, the land is different. So I'm
I think a million years is enough.
So I'm interested in how you think about the words. And
thank you for that. You've given me a lot to go on there. Thank you. Great question. Why land specifically, not Earth cinema, not So there's a few things that are important about land. Land in this book and for these filmmakers and artists is understood as 3 primary things at the same time. So land is an ecological space. It is a habitat. It's an ecosystem. Land is also a set of territories, a geopolitical space. That's a political lens. And land is also something that we represent in words and in images. Land is a cultural construct. And the filmmakers I write about understood land in these 3 ways, and these 3 ways have been completely connected. So, for example, the way we represent land tells a lot about the way we feel about land, whether it's inert wasteland, for example. Who's determining that waste? This goes back to the question of perspectives. For whom is it a wasteland? Whose home was it? So immediately, if you're presenting something as a wasteland, or you're writing about it and using that word, you're immediately into the political question of land. Oh, okay, who is devaluing this land? So it's got this combined or integrated definition, land. That's one reason it's important to use. Another reason is, if we think about the word landscape, which is so connected to art history, and a certain set, again, of perspectives, landscape painting as a genre, for example, it was usually something for the celebration of extraction, although it was never called that. You know, like the elite, the landowners in this country, for example, would commission an artist to paint a landscape for them of their property. It's about territory again, and the celebration of the rural bucolic landscape is, in another way, read as a diagram of power, of commoners pushed off that land. So I wanted to use land to evoke this history of landscape in art and in art history. And then we can also think of land art. And land art as a category, it would be interesting to see who you think of if I say land artist, who you're thinking of. But there's one kind of group of land artists who can think about people like Michael Heiser, who were doing very, very monumental, quite bombastic sculptures and installations on the land. And I'm curious, like, how are they relating to that land? Like, what is that doing on the land? We could think about other people, Andy Goldsworthy, David Nash, people who do much more ephemeral projects. That's a different kind of land art. So I also wanted to engage, or to kind of give a nod to land art in art history, and that this set of filmmakers is doing something a little bit different to them, very different to somebody like Michael Heiser. And then you mentioned the idea that not all lands have cinemas anymore, because maybe the cinema is not there, or they don't have the infrastructure, or people have been displaced. I think that's really important. And in the book, I describe cinema as a social architecture. And what I mean by that is it doesn't have to be built. We're not talking about like the everyman and the Curzon and the picture house. We're talking about somebody who just hangs up a sheet in a community garden and projects a film on it. Is very, very grassroots. Or the mud and straw cinema that they built in Japan that I mentioned. It's more important to bring people together and to do really ad hoc screenings because of this social relational approach. Somebody who's written interestingly about this in China is Jie Li, who writes about her book Cinematic Guerrillas is about the people who would travel around China with film in their van, showing film during the Mao period. And then you mentioned the map. And that's really interesting. I remember when this is like a really kind of dumb thing to say, but I remember when I first moved to Japan, and I sat in my Japanese school, day one of learning the language, and the world map on the wall was a completely different shape to the world map that I'm used to growing up in Britain, because the centre of the map was in a different position to what I was used to. And I think that's fascinating. I just this afternoon was teaching, some of you in here, I was just teaching an undergrad seminar, and we were thinking about that iconic photograph, Earthrise, from 1968, the first photograph that NASA, William Anders took from the moon, looking back for the first time at planet Earth as a whole. And we were talking about Samantha Harvey's book, Orbital, and how it's really interesting that the astronauts in that book, they have this view of the Earth, which is of course devoid of borders. There's no geopolitical borders that they can see from the space station. They're just seeing the globe as one continuous sphere, and weather knows no borders. And so I think it's interesting that you bring that up. And in a way, I don't want to show you a map, because the map is sort of going against the politics of this project or what the filmmakers were doing. But I guess the dotted line helps break the borders, because people were crossing borders all the time.
Okay, there's a question from Manish.
Thank you for your presentation. I just have a very quick question, actually, which is about the relationship between land cinema and third cinema. Because from what I understand, you're saying land cinema is a kind of a movement of integration and reintegration into land. But from what I remember with third cinema, it's a really violent anti-imperial cinematic movement that, the examples I remember from being a student were dealing with violent anthropology and a lot of formal experimentation. So I was just wondering how those actually are part of the same.
How they relate. Yeah. So several filmmakers in the book would have identified, or it was never as formal as being a member of land cinema, but they went to conferences and screenings that then became associated with land cinema, with third cinema. An example would be Marta Rodriguez and Jorge Silva in Colombia. They were making films with indigenous groups, the Coconuco and Nasa peoples in southwest Colombia, about reclaiming their land from the hacienda system. And so this is coming out of a really, really anti-colonial way of viewing the world, but it's very tied also to the earth. And so one of their films is called Nuestra Voz de Tierra, Memoria y Futuro. So this is our voice of the earth first, and of memory in the future. So they're thinking about ancestors in this land, but also a real connection to the other than human that are on their land and from whom they are living, with whom they're living in land relation and community. So another example is the Malian collective, very, very much connected with, they're reading people like Amilcar Cabral, they're watching third cinema, but they're making an organic farm themselves, and they're filming things to do with the irrigation of their land. So I think it's like a very earthy cousin of third cinema.
Can I take that? So if I remember correctly, third cinema was a term used at the time by the activists, right? So, and it was partly a way of taking up the notion of the third world, which was initially, I think, a term adopted by people from that part of the world to kind of organize themselves against colonial exploitation, and then like the big countries, so the United States and so on. So the activists in third cinema understood themselves to be third cinema, and that was the basis for their international collaboration. But land cinema is a term you've invented, right? So it's not a term that pre-existed the arrival of this book, apart from maybe a PhD, from which the book is based on. And I wanted to ask you, I think, a biographical question, because I think one of the things that we struggle with in terms of the kind of practices we're interested in is how people go from exploring an area of sort of interest, doing some research, figuring out, and then being able to identify it as something that they want to take up in their own terms. So I was wondering when the term land cinema arrived for you in your research, what happened when you came to the term, and what it changed for you when you understood the material you're looking at as land cinema rather than an array of material from, say, third cinema. Like, did land cinema enable you to generate to identify the net, identify the network, for example, or I guess it's like.
Yeah, what came first?
Well, just when did land cinema arrive for you, and sort of what happened once you arrived at the term? Partly as a model for like how to do some research and then build something out of it, which is then your own, which you then communicate to others, right? Which I think is like the common project.
Yeah.
Oops.
I actually don't remember when I kind of solidified this term as being one that I wanted to use, and yeah, you're right, I made this land cinema, and
That's
I guess
a good thing.
yeah,
it's
yeah.
a good thing.
I guess I felt like I needed a term to describe what is actually a really capacious category, because we're moving between the city and the country, because we're disrupting that binary. It's a false dichotomy. We're looking at individual filmmakers, we're looking at collectives. It's happening all across the world. Did seem to be happening at this particular time, and that seemed important because you get this huge acceleration in what David Harvey calls space-time compression. This at the beginning of what we would now know as neoliberal and highly extractive path that we embarked on round about the time that land cinema is emerging, and people are thinking maybe we need to organise forms of solidarity and resistance against this. So you get things like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, and similar associations in Japan, a recycling movement formed at exactly this time, 1969, 1970. So I felt like I needed a term to label what was going on, but it also needed to be a term that was open enough to allow for this diversity. So somebody I didn't speak about today in the talk, but who's really important in the book, is this artist filmmaker called Anne Charlotte Robertson, who was based in Massachusetts, and she made film diaries on a Super 8 film in her own garden and a community garden. And they're very confessional, they're very personal. She's dealing with mental health problems throughout her life that meant she was hospitalised every year. And the garden and the filming of her garden was a form of therapy, ecotherapy, you could call it, for herself. But her films are also, they're not just personal, they're also very, very political, because she's seeing the destruction of the environment as being part of why she in the world are fundamentally not okay. And so holding her camera and gardening is a really important way of being for her. So how to put somebody who's as personal, like a story as personal as that, in with the Colombian examples, the collective who were making work with indigenous nations, and then somebody in Tokyo who's looking at the really urbanized landscape. It needed to be this term that's really, really quite open. To tell you when, I mean, it was definitely there when I was doing my PhD. I don't know exactly when, but I think it did make stuff easier for me, because then I had this baggy bag, maybe we could call it, borrowed from Ursula K. Le Guin, to put stuff in then and to start telling a story about this thing. And I think what I mentioned in answer to the first question about why land, this three-pronged understanding of what land is, that it's something ecological, it's something political, geopolitical, and it's something that we represent culturally in words and images, was really key to thinking, okay, this category makes sense for me as a framework.
But it's also across history, right? So it goes further back and further forward.
Yeah. I mean, another way of thinking about the book is that it's like a zoom in to one really important moment in land cinema. But like I mentioned in the final chapter, I'm talking about 3 contemporary examples, and I think and I hope it will go on and become. I think it is becoming like in the work of Jumana Mana, for example. It's like it is really a category that we need, and it's becoming more and more relevant today.
Are there any more questions? We're finished. There's 2. Do you have one, James? No? Okay, so there's 2 questions.
And one up there.
Oh, there's maybe Mr. Mike, it's over here. Can we pass the mic here? We'll take all 3 because we're kind of running out of time. So there's one question here. One question was somewhere over there.
I'll get my pen ready.
And then one question at the back. So we'll go in that order. But we'll take all 3 questions and then Becca, go ahead.
My question is, do you think there's a possibility of land cinema beyond the Anthropocene, like in an age of automatized extraction? I think most of the cinema we've seen center on the very modernist practices or industries.
Okay, can you just ask Brett, can you take the mic? Maybe let's just pause a bit and let people leave. Okay, go ahead.
I was just going to ask what the relationship of land cinema might be to an idea of immediacy, because you've spoken about, this kind of DIY, quite contingent way of both filming but potentially screening as well, and just throwing up a sheet and projecting onto it. And with somebody like Anne Charlotte Robertson, it's very much her immediate domestic environment, even though she's also talking about the environment beyond in terms of her plants, her garden. So I wondered about that link, and then also what happens when films that are either made or initially screened in this very kind of immediate circumstance are then taken beyond that to the film festival, to the social media, under the authorship of a single person.
Cool.
Okay, so maybe take these 2 while the mic goes to the back.
Yeah, great. Thanks for both of those questions. You mentioned beyond the Anthropocene in your first question, and the idea about in an age of automated extraction, but I kind of would push back against the idea of that not being very human, because I think there's still human actors involved and automating all of it and making it in their own image for their own ends. So it doesn't seem like an end to if I'm understanding you right, for me, it doesn't seem like an end to an age of humans at all. It's just an accelerated repetition of another technological, I don't want to say advancement, another technological chapter. But it seems like very, very human still what's going on. And I think there would be even more room for land cinema to resist it and to provide kind of what I said, like the oppositional and the propositional, or the critical and the creative, to question what these activities are and whom they benefit. The question about immediacy is really interesting. So what happens when, like you say, that these films are made often in a really rough and ready way? This is also a hallmark of third cinema as well as land cinema, thrown up on a tarpaulin, projected in order to galvanise people sometimes to go to the next protest, or to, it was so much about spreading things in an immediate context. But I think then when we look at these films from half a century ago, some of them, they're so instructive and they feel immediate to me now as well. I think history can actually feel immediate because you notice echoes or rhymes and is filled with hope. Like one thing I hope the book is hopeful, but also grounded in that. Not just like a kind of wishful thinking, but I wanted it to be a history book which has got evidence of what people have done all around the world in these crisis moments, doing this amazing stuff. So I think it still, hopefully, feels quite immediate. The way I've tried to write is to let you know about these people and what pressures they were experiencing, what they were pushing against, what they were feeling, what they were hoping. It goes back to the idea of reparative reading that I mentioned, Cedric's idea. The way I want to read history and write history is to be in the immediate with these people 50 years ago, thinking about their struggles as being so similar in many ways to what we're facing today, the complexities and the complicities which we all have to deal with. Should we take the other one?
Yeah, the last question at the back.
It seems like a lot of the artists written about in the book have a very solidified idea of what nature is, very much based in this kind of pastoral, rural idealism, and kind of see that as having a conceptual monopoly on the idea of nature, and kind of how that relates to kind of detaching from an idea of any particular land, whether urban or rural, having a monopoly on the idea of nature.
Great question, thank you for that. This is really smart kind of articulation. You've got the conceptual monopoly over nature, and therefore that some lands become more natural than others. So I mentioned really briefly in the talk that I use this term wounded land to describe landscapes. I take that term from Liam Simpson, an Anishinaabe scholar in Canada, who writes about wounded land as places that are not the pastoral, that are not the green, that are not the perfect. And Liam Simpson is saying that we must include those landscapes in an idea of nature if we're going to find a viable way forward. Anna Singh says something similar. She calls it third nature. And some of the filmmakers, you're totally right, like some of the filmmakers, Ogawa Pro, who I mentioned tonight, this kind of fixation on the Edo period in Japan, the idea of sort of purity and rice and valleys and alpine scenes, whatever. Some of it's really romantic, and I question that in the book. There are other filmmakers. Barbara Ruccolo is an example. So she comes from the LA Rebellion, this amazing short film. It's only like 6 minutes long that I write about in the book, which is filmed in a really desecrated landscape in what's in southern Los Angeles. This bulldozed intersection of streets, which used to be people's homes, it's been bulldozed to make way for a highway. There's shards of glass and wood and weeds, and it's a wounded land, you could call it. But she makes this really mournful and also beautiful and uplifting blessing. She calls it a ritual, that film, to bless the landscape. So I think she would be an example. Maybe Anne Charlotte Robertson also, like she's working in suburban Massachusetts in these community gardens, but you also see plenty of the city around her and the kind of the pollution and the construction that she's witnessing, and she's bringing that in her idea of nature. I think is a bit more expansive, but I think you're totally right to be questioning what is this concept of nature and who gets to define it.
Great, thank you, Becca. We've overrun a bit. Just to remind you that Becca's book is for sale. We'll be selling it outside. These are just here for display. And there's also the parlour. So I think Becca's going to stick around for some drinks and you can ask some questions. So thanks, Becca. Amazingly effective.